5 stories the rulebook can't explain. We stitch together the bans that erase names, the flashpoints that split scorecards, the moments so wild the UFC rewrote policy overnight, and the unwritten code veterans whisper but never say on camera. You'll see who crossed the line, who paid for it, and why certain moves never get booked again. Stay to the end. The last clip reveals the pattern running through it all, the boundary that decides careers. If you love the fight game without filters, you're in the right place. This is PunchNet.
In the UFC, not all rules are written, but every fighter knows them. From fake glove touches, to silent agreements about fouls, to champions keeping their belts in razor-close fights. These aren't in the rulebook, but break them, and you'll lose more than just a match. These are the UFC's unspoken laws, the unwritten rules of the fight game. Starting with fake glove touching. At the beginning of many fights, it's common to see fighters reach out for a glove touch, a brief moment of mutual respect before the chaos begins. But when someone fakes that gesture just to land a cheap shot, one of the most universally hated unwritten rules in combat sports. Here's the thing, you're not required to touch gloves. If you've got bad blood or just want to get straight to business, you can skip it and no one hold against you. Fighters do it all the time. But if you pretend like you're going in for a glove touch and your opponent lets their guard down expecting that brief pause and aggression, and then you strike instead, that's dirty. No question about it. Technically, yes, it's legal, but morally, it's slimy. Fighters are taught from day one to protect themselves at all times. That's true, but the glove touch is seen as a small, unsaid agreement, a fleeting gesture of sportsmanship, a silent acknowledgement of respect before war begins. Violating that moment just to gain an advantage doesn't make you clever. It makes you look cheap. Even in boxing, when Floyd Mayweather sucker punched Victor Ortiz right after an awkward mid-fight hug, fans were divided. Some defended it by the rulebook. Others called it dishonorable. In MMA, it's even more frowned upon. Fake glove touches are so rare that when someone actually does it, fans remember, and not in a good way. And if you think that's bad, wait till you hear what fighters get away with next. The unspoken free pass. In most UFC fights, it feels like every fighter gets one free foul, whether it's a low blow, an eye poke, or grabbing the fence. The first offense usually doesn't come with any real consequences. The referee just gives a warning and lets the fight continue. No point deductions, no timeouts, just a verbal note and back to business. It's not an official rule written anywhere, but we see it happen all the time. A fighter lands a groin strike, the ref pauses the action, gives a quick warning, and resumes the fight. Same goes for eye pokes or blatant fence grabs used to prevent a takedown. Even when it's clear and obvious, the first foul almost never results in any immediate penalty. This has led many to believe that some fighters knowingly take advantage of it. Maybe they throw a questionable strike early on to slow their opponent down. As long as they play it off like an accident and it's their first offense, they know they'll likely get away with it. But that one accidentally shifts the momentum of a fight. There have even been bouts where fighters commit multiple fouls, 2, 3, even 4, and still never get docked a single point. This system needs to change. Points should be taken after a clear foul, not only after repeated ones. Because right now, as long as you commit just one, chances are you're in the clear. Just don't push your luck, or you might eventually lose a point. But not every foul gives you an advantage. Some give you a way out. The question is, will you take it? Imagine you're in a fight and things aren't going your way. You're down on the scorecards, getting outworked round after round. And then suddenly your opponent lands an illegal strike. Maybe it's a knee to the head while you're grounded. Now, technically you have a choice. You could tell the ref, I can't continue, and win the fight by disqualification. You get your hand raised, your record stays clean, and on paper, it goes down as a win. But here's the thing, most fighters and a lot of fans see that as a weak move. Even if it's completely within the rules, it's still frowned upon. If you are clearly losing, many believe you should push through and keep fighting unless you're genuinely unable to continue. Taking the DQ win can feel like gaming the system. One of the most talked about examples, Aljamain Sterling versus Petr Yan. Yan threw an illegal knee, and Sterling said he couldn't go on. He won by DQ, and with that, became the UFC bantamweight champion. The backlash was immediate. Many fans believed he exaggerated the damage to get the belt, even though the strike was undeniably illegal. Now contrast that with Anthony Smith. Jon Jones hit him with a clear illegal knee during their title fight. Smith was behind on the cards and could have taken the DQ win and walked away as champion. Instead, he shrugged it off and kept fighting. He lost the fight, but gained something else. Respect. So here's the unspoken rule. If you're getting beat and you get fouled, don't quit unless you're seriously hurt. The win might look good on your record, but fans and fellow fighters won't forget how you got it. You lost. Now what? In the UFC, one mistake can end your entire career. A late punch, a dirty submission, a moment of rage, or something much darker. These aren't just losses. These are bans for life. Today, we're diving into the most shocking UFC bans ever. Start with Paul Daly. He was a renowned British fighter in the welterweight division and a fan favorite for his powerful and tactical prowess. However, at UFC 113, Daly let his emotions override his brain and fatefully let them end his UFC career. On May 8, 2010, Daly fought Josh Koscheck. The winner of this fight was going to become the next challenger against Georges St-Pierre for the UFC welterweight championship. Not only that, the winner would also get the opportunity to coach against St-Pierre on the 12th season of The Ultimate Fighter. In the past, Daly had shown immense promise, and many fans believed he had what it took to become the challenger. But things didn't go as they were planned. In the first round, Koscheck appeared to simulate being hit with an illegal knee, which resulted in a point deduction for Daly. This caused tempers to flare. During the fight, Koscheck went on to dominate Daly with his wrestling for most of the match and eventually was declared the winner by unanimous decision. But Daly didn't seem like he wanted to accept this defeat. Against the fence, he threw a punch at Koscheck after the final bell. The altercation, although short, quickly became one of the biggest scandals in UFC at the time. And by the end of the night, UFC President Dana White came forward with a shocking revelation. He announced that he was banning Daly from the UFC for life. White said, "There's no excuse for that. These guys are professional athletes. You don't ever hit a guy blatantly after the bell like that, whether you're frustrated or not." He added, "I don't care if he fights in every show all over the world and becomes the best, and everybody thinks he's the pound-for-pound best in the world. He will never fight in the UFC ever again." White followed by saying he spoke to Daly after the fight, and Daly had claimed he had not heard the bell. Daly later apologized for his actions after returning to the United Kingdom, saying that Koscheck's trash-talking pushed him over the edge, but that there was no excuse for his rash decision. While Daly did go on to fight in other tournaments, his UFC career truly came to an end that night. This, however, is nothing in comparison to what Rousimar Palhares did to get banned. Rousimar Palhares is a Brazilian mixed martial artist that was banned from the UFC for his almost sinister lack of sportsmanship. Palhares is mainly known for his insanely powerful ground game. 12 out of his 16 submission victories have come from leg locks. But that's where things get tricky. He's also known for his complete and absolute refusal to release submission holds, even when the opposing fighter has signaled submission or when the referee has called stop. Not releasing holds is already a serious offense, as it causes irreversible and unneeded physical damage to your opponent who's already yielded the fight. But Palhares liked to take it a step further. He would intentionally crank the hook further upon taps. Historically, Palhares wasn't known for following the rules. In the UFC middleweight division, after a loss, the UFC announced that Palhares had tested positive for elevated testosterone levels in his post-fight drug test and subsequently had been suspended for 9 months. When Palhares eventually dropped down to the welterweight division, he had his fateful fight against Mike Pierce on October 9th, 2013. Here, Palhares went in for his usual heel hook, and just 31 seconds into round 1, he finished with a submission. It was the only submission of the night, but instead of walking away with a bonus check, he walked right into a major controversy. Palhares had simply refused to release the hold for too long. Pierce, showing visible agony and pain, had tapped out 8 times, but rather than letting go, Palhares cranked the hook further. The referee at the time, Keith Peterson, went in headfirst to ease the pressure on Mike's leg while urging Palhares to let go. While he eventually did, the UFC later called it unsportsmanlike conduct. To put in perspective, the average time it takes for a fighter to let go is around 0.14 seconds. The fact that it took him longer seemed like a demented attempt to seriously injure his opponent. The next day, while conducting an interview, UFC President Dana White told ESPN's Jeremy Schaap that he was going to cut Palhares from their roster immediately and that he's done. Later, Zuffa released a statement via UFC reminding fans that this wasn't Palhares' first warning. He'd already been suspended for 90 days for a similar incident in 2010, where he didn't release a heel hook, coupled with his drug test failure. Although Palhares is still a successful fighter, the UFC truly did not look back at him, just like they didn't with Jason High. Jason High's UFC career didn't end in the octagon due to a loss. It ended with a split-second decision fueled by frustration, a decision he paid a very hefty fee for. In 2014, Jason stepped into the cage to face Rafael dos Anjos. The fight in question didn't go his way, and Dos Anjos was relentless. After a flurry of strikes, the referee stepped in and waved it off, calling it a TKO loss. Jason, however, didn't see it that way. He'd already lost many fights before this, and this one was the last shot he had to prove himself. He thought the stoppage was premature, and in the heat of the moment, he snapped. In a career-ending move, he turned to the referee, Kevin Mulhall, and shoved him. Right there, his whole career took a nosedive. Touching a referee is one of the biggest taboos in combat sports, and it clearly disgusted Dana White. I'm going to cut him. I'll look at the way Paul Daly put his hands on his opponent after a fight was over. You don't ever fucking touch a referee, ever. You're done here. He's been apologizing on Twitter, but he's done. Dana White comparing it to Daly shows how critical Jason's actions were. Daly was banned for life, and now Jason was added to that very short list. Within hours, Jason's name was scrubbed from the UFC roster. He issued a public apology on Twitter, hoping to smooth things over, but it didn't matter. The UFC had made its decision, and it wasn't changing. All this showed was that the organization holds its referees in the highest regard. They're there to protect fighters, make the tough calls, and keep order. The moment that order is broken, even for a second, the UFC wanted to prove that it acts fast. For Jason, it was a career-ending misstep. One moment of emotion, and just like that, the UFC door slammed shut. But for others, like War Machine, the actions weren't split-second decisions, but extended levels of demented behavior. What if I told you the UFC once moved an entire event just to protect Jon Jones? A fighter leaned on a towel to keep his belt, and Brock Lesnar fought juice to the gills with the UFC's blessing. This isn't conspiracy. This is the dark side of MMA. But the dark side of MMA doesn't just haunt fighters. Sometimes it targets the media too. At UFC 199, veteran MMA journalist Ariel Helwani was unexpectedly kicked out of the event and hit with a lifetime ban, simply for doing his job. Ariel had uncovered a major scoop. The UFC was secretly planning to bring back Brock Lesnar for UFC 200, a shocking return that was meant to be a dramatic surprise announcement during the live pay-per-view broadcast. At the time, the general belief was that Brock had fully retired from MMA and was focused solely on his WWE career, so this revelation was massive. Before the UFC could unveil the surprise themselves, Ariel reported the story on his platform. Dana White didn't take it lightly. Instead of recognizing it as legitimate journalism, he reacted with visible fury. He called Ariel over, berated him in front of others, had security escort him out of the building, and issued a lifetime ban, stripping him of event access, credentials, everything, all for reporting the truth. The MMA community erupted in support. Fighters, fans, and fellow journalists stood behind Ariel, seeing the incident for what it truly was, an attempt by Dana to control the narrative and suppress independent media coverage, just as tightly as he runs the UFC itself. The public outcry grew so loud that the UFC eventually had no choice but to reverse the ban. But Dana never let it go. Even years later, the tension between the two remains. Dana has hurled countless insults at Ariel, while Ariel has stayed composed and professional. Yet Dana continues to carry that grudge like it happened yesterday.
Don't give a shit what Ariel Helwani thinks.
Fair enough.
Who the f*** Ariel Helwani?
Then came the Reebok deal, a move that looked professional on the outside, but behind the scenes, it crushed fighters' incomes. When the UFC signed an exclusive apparel deal with Reebok in 2015, it was marketed as a major move toward professionalizing the sport, introducing standardized uniforms, cleaner visuals, and unified branding. On paper, it sounded like progress, but for the fighters, it quickly turned into a financial disaster. Before Reebok entered the picture, fighters were free to wear gear adorned with personal sponsors. For many, especially the lesser-known athletes, those sponsorship deals often paid more than the fight purse itself. Once the Reebok deal kicked in, all personal sponsorships inside the octagon were banned. Fighters were now required to wear UFC-issued gear featuring only the Reebok logo. In return, they received a standardized payout, one that was significantly lower than what they had been earning from individual sponsors. Top-tier fighters who once pulled in tens of thousands from sponsorships were now making only a few thousand per fight. Lower-ranked fighters received even less. It didn't matter how popular or marketable you were. Everyone was forced into the same pay scale. And for most, it was a serious pay cut. The backlash was immediate. fighters voiced their frustrations publicly. Fans weren't impressed either. While the UFC pushed the narrative that this was a professional leap forward, it became increasingly clear who the real winners were: the UFC and Reebok, not the athletes putting their health and careers on the line inside the cage. But if you thought sponsorship money was shady, wait till you hear how the UFC let fighters turn into literal superhumans. If you're watching the UFC in the early 2000s, you'll definitely remember TRT Vitor. He didn't just look like a fighter, he looked like a final boss from a video game, shredded beyond belief, launching head kicks with the speed and ease of jabs. The man was absolutely terrifying. One of those brutal kicks landed on Michael Bisping, so vicious that it ended up costing Bisping vision in one of his eyes. That version of Vitor was powered by TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. At the time, TRT was completely legal in MMA. Both the UFC and the Athletic Commission had signed off on it for fighters who were diagnosed with low testosterone levels. In theory, it was supposed to be a medical solution, but Vitor used it to maximum effect, pushing his physique and performance to near superhuman levels. He exploited the loophole to the fullest, turning himself into a monster inside the cage. Eventually, people started calling it out. TRT wasn't creating fairness. It was creating freakishly enhanced versions of fighters. And Vitor was the poster boy for everything wrong with it. The backlash kept growing. So in 2014, the UFC and Athletic Commissions banned TRT entirely. And when Vitor returned, he looked like a completely different man. Gone was the chiseled menace. In his place stood a guy who resembled a middle-aged dad trying out CrossFit. The speed, the explosiveness, the raw power all vanished. The transformation was undeniable. Chris Weidman walked right through him. And this new version of Vitor was just a shadow of the beast he once was. MMA used to be a wild experiment. No weight classes, no groin protection, and no clue what was legal. From nut shots to speedos, these are the insane moments that forced the UFC to rewrite its rules forever. These moments didn't just shock fans, they changed the sport forever. And if you love the real stories behind MMA, hit that subscribe button now, because we're going deep. Start with Royce Gracie, too dominant. Royce Gracie entered the UFC and quickly became a household name due to his unparalleled Brazilian jiu-jitsu skills. His dominance was so overwhelming that it prompted significant changes in the structure of the sport. Gracie's success led to the introduction of time limits for fights, which prevented endless bouts that could leave fighters exhausted and at risk. Additionally, the establishment of weight classes ensured fairer matchups, allowing fighters of similar sizes to compete against one another. Moreover, the introduction of rounds and judges transformed the scoring system, providing a more structured approach to determining the winner of a fight. As many have said, Royce didn't break the rules. He exposed the lack of them. His impact forced the UFC to adapt to a new reality where fighters needed to be more well-rounded, leading to a more competitive and exciting sport. Next up, groin shot crackdown. Back in a no-holds-barred era, groin shots were totally legal. You could openly sock or kick someone's family jewels, and the ref would just let it ride. And of course, someone eventually did it. Enter UFC 4, 1994. Keith Hackney versus Joe's son, who, by the way, would later be convicted of some truly horrible crimes. But in the octagon, that's not what he's remembered for. During their fight, Joe's son had Hackney in a headlock from the bottom. Hackney, looking around like, is this really legal, just starts hammering him in the nuts over and over. 15 shots. No exageración. Joe's son eventually tapped out from a testicular beatdown. And that wasn't even the worst one. Fast forward to IVC 1, 1997. The International Veil Tudo Championship in Brazil, where Gary Goodridge took things to the next level. His opponent, Pedro Octavio, ended up underneath him, and Goodridge dug his toes into the guy's trunks, using them for grip, like rock climbing, but disgusting. Then he grabbed a literal handful of his opponent's junk to control the position. The ref didn't stop it. The crowd didn't even flinch. And yes, Goodridge won the fight. So between UFC and IVC, fighters were treating groins like legal targets. And unsurprisingly, it got banned. The UFC officially outlawed groin strikes in 1997, just months after IVC changed their rules. Digging into your opponent's trunks became a punishable offense. Which again, why was that ever allowed? Now, every fighter wears a protective cup, and refs always say, protect yourself at all times. In this context, that's just good advice. The point is, if your game plan used to involve nut shots, those days are over. And next, 12 to 6 elbows, MMA's most pointless rule. This one's easily the most controversial rule in all of MMA. And it all started because a 6 feet 10 inches giant smashed a smaller dude with elbows from the top rope. The rule? No, 12 to 6 elbows. That's a straight downward strike. Picture the hands of a clock going from 12, noon to 6. Illegal. Always has been under the unified rules. But ask any fighter, coach, or fan, and they'll probably say the same thing. Why? In the UFC, not every battle ends with blood and bruises. Some end in silence. A kiss that stunned the world. Half a pound that cost a crown. A 5-year exile over smoke. A war snub by the judges. And a champion crucified for playing it safe. These aren't just controversies. They're turning points. Moments that never made the highlight reel, but changed everything. Welcome to the dark side of the octagon, where rules are bent, reputations are made, and history is rewritten without a single punch thrown. If you love stories the cameras tried to forget, hit subscribe. You're about to see MMA like never before. Starting with UFC Weird Kiss. At UFC 306, Merab Dvalishvili did something no one had ever seen in a UFC title fight. He kissed his opponent. Midway through round 2, while riding Sean O'Malley's back in a grappling exchange, Merab leaned in and pressed his lips against the back of O'Malley's neck. The crowd fell silent. So did the commentary booth. It was so surreal, referee Herb Dean had to step in and say words no one ever expected to hear in the octagon. Don't kiss him. And Merab didn't deny it. After the fight, he explained that it was a mental tactic, a psychological play meant to assert dominance, shake O'Malley's composure, and make a statement. It wasn't disrespect, he told reporters. It was dominance. I was showing him who's the boss. That's why I kissed him. Dana White's reaction? Dry and confused. Weird. I don't know what that was. And maybe that's exactly the point. It wasn't a strike or a foul. It was a bizarre middle school mind game played out on the biggest stage of the year. But the kiss was just one part of the story. The rest of it was pure suffocation. 5 rounds of relentless pressure, chain wrestling, mat returns, and positional control. Merab didn't knock O'Malley out. He drowned him minute by minute. O'Malley had flashes, quick escapes, glimmers of striking brilliance. But by the final bell, the decision was clear. 49 to 46, 48 to 47, 48 to 47. A new bantamweight king was crowned. Ever the showman, O'Malley took it on the chin, but with a grimace. That was gross, he said, leaving the octagon shaking his head. Yet for all of Merab's grinding dominance, it was the kiss that went viral. The internet lit up. Some laughed, some cringed, others felt it crossed a line, but no one forgot it. But not every headline is made inside the cage. Sometimes, the biggest blows land before the fight even begins. Charles Oliveira walked into UFC 274 as the reigning lightweight champion. But before the fight even started, his title was already gone. At the official weigh-ins, Charles stepped on the scale and came in at 155.5 pounds, just half a pound over the lightweight championship limit. Under commission rules, for a title fight, even half a pound over is disqualifying. The response was immediate and brutal. Oliveira was stripped of the title. The belt was declared vacant, no exceptions. But something didn't sit right. According to Charles and his team, he had checked his weight multiple times the night before using the digital scale in his hotel room. It consistently read 155.0. His nutritionist, strength coach, and coaches all confirmed he was on point. Yet, by morning, the official scale said otherwise. And Charles wasn't alone. Several other fighters on the same card, including featherweights and flyweights, also missed weight by exactly 0.5 pounds. Rumors spread like wildfire. Someone had tampered with the scale. Later, UFC officials confirmed that the digital scale had been recalibrated, likely by foreign fighters or cornermen unfamiliar with how the mechanism worked. It wasn't illegal, but it was enough to throw the readings off, just enough to matter. Still, the Arizona State Athletic Commission didn't budge. There were no allowances, no exceptions, no reviews. Charles came back an hour later and made weight on a second attempt, but by then, it was too late. The rulebook was clear. Only fighters who make weight on the first try are eligible to compete for the title. The defending champion had become just another contender. But Charles didn't fold. He stepped into the octagon that night without his belt and submitted Justin Gaethje in the first round. It didn't matter. The win wasn't recorded as a title defense. The belt remained vacant. The champion had done everything right and still walked away empty-handed. If you thought losing a belt over half a pound was harsh, in the UFC, what you say after the fight might define you more than what you did inside the cage. In MMA, there's one golden rule that fighters and fans alike tend to agree on: don't make excuses. Take the loss, own it, and move forward. But despite how widely accepted this idea is, fighters break this rule all the time. Right after a fight, you'll often hear something like, "I'm not making excuses," but followed by a long list of excuses. It's always the same story: "I was battling the flu," or "my training camp was a disaster," or "my foot was injured the whole time." It's their way of trying to explain a poor performance without sounding like they're whining, even though that's exactly how it comes across. Almost every fighter has done this at some point, and honestly, it's one of the most frustrating habits in the sport. No one forced you into the cage. You knew your condition, knew the risks, and still made the walk. That means you accepted the terms. Now here's the twist. If a fighter wins and later says, "I had a broken hand the whole time," fans celebrate it. They see it as a badge of toughness. But when a fighter loses and says the same thing, it sounds like damage control. Like they're looking for a way to soften the defeat instead of just accepting it. This rule exists because fighting is about accountability. The moment you agree to step into that cage, you're saying, "I'm ready." If things go wrong, that's still on you. Sure, most fighters aren't 100% on fight night. Most of them do have valid reasons for falling short, but bringing those reasons up afterward rarely helps. It just makes it look like you're trying to explain away the loss instead of owning it. And in this sport, nothing earns respect like taking a loss on the chin and saying he was the better man tonight. Sheen, born Jonathan Koppenhaver, was once an up-and-coming name in the fighting world. But what happened outside the cage is what would ultimately define him. In 2014, War Machine's life and career took a violent and irreversible turn, all by his own hands. He was the cause of a brutally violent attack on his ex-girlfriend Christy Mack and her friend who was present in the house at the time. According to reports, he had broken into her house and, in a fit of rage, got into a physical altercation with her and her friend Corey Thomas. After beating Corey to the point where he started convulsing, he told him to leave the house. Now that he had Christy alone, he grotesquely started beating her until he caused her to have a broken eye socket, multiple broken ribs, and lost teeth. He also attempted to sexually assault her and cut all her hair off. After all of this, he went to look for a knife, at one point claiming that he had to offer. Christy took this window of opportunity to get outside and bang on any neighbor's door until they listened and called the cops. What's truly disturbing, however, is how Jonathan portrayed it in his tweets after the incident. He alleged that he loved her and ended up fighting for his life, contrary to what actually happened. In response, Christy posted the graphic images of the aftermath of their altercation on her Twitter to show proof of what she went through. War Machine was arrested and later convicted on 29 charges, including sexual assault and kidnapping. The story made national headlines, and not just in the fight world. After a crime like this, all chances of having any career dissolved. National headlines were one thing. It also took the MMA world by storm. Everyone was questioning the sport and the type of people it brought into the spotlight. Fingers were being pointed, and something had to be done. It really frustrated the UFC. Every headline labeled him as an ex-UFC fighter. And Dana White? He wasn't having it. "It's horrible, man. Horrible," White said in response to the media frenzy. "And every time I got to see ex-UFC fighter, when the stories are written, he fought twice in the UFC 6 years ago. He's a current Bellator Viacom fighter." White went on to say that his staff contacted news outlets to correct the narrative, only to hear, "We don't know what Bellator is." His response was simple. "Ever heard of Viacom? That's who he fights for. He fights for Viacom, not the UFC." The UFC had long cut ties with War Machine. The organization's stance on violent criminal behavior outside the octagon is crystal clear: zero tolerance, no comebacks, and definitely no reconsideration. War Machine was sentenced to life in prison, with an increasingly slim chance of parole, erasing any hope of a return to UFC or a normal life outside of bars. Now, he's just another reminder, one of many we'll see further in this video, that talent in the cage means nothing if you can't control what happens outside of it. But this next one, it wasn't about drugs or sponsorships. It was about insider betting, betrayal, and millions at stake. James Krauss was once known as a respected UFC veteran and a sharp-minded coach, But now, he's at the heart of one of the most shocking betting scandals in MMA history. It all began in 2022 when his fighter Darrick Minner entered a bout carrying an undisclosed injury, something only Krauss and Minner were aware of. Just minutes before the fight, a sudden surge of suspicious bets flooded in, all predicting that Minner would lose early. And that's exactly how it played out. Minner threw a single kick, aggravated the injury, and the fight was stopped shortly afterward. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots. It was soon revealed that Krauss had been running a private Discord server where he regularly shared betting advice. In fact, he openly claimed he made more money gambling on fights than he ever did coaching or competing. That revelation didn't sit well with the UFC. Krauss was swiftly suspended, and any fighters training under him were banned from UFC competition until further notice. But things didn't stop there. In 2025, the scandal deepened when flyweight Jeff Molina, one of Krauss's top students, was handed a 3-year suspension. Investigators found that Molina had prior knowledge of Minner's injury and placed bets on the fight without informing the commission. Today, Krauss claims he's millions of dollars in debt and is now trying to recover financially through real estate ventures. Meanwhile, a federal investigation is still ongoing and further legal action may be on the horizon. And if you thought insider betting was bad, the UFC once let a juiced-up Brock Lesnar walk straight into the octagon, no questions asked. Back at UFC 200, everything was falling apart. Jon Jones was pulled from the card due to a doping violation. The much-anticipated Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz rematch wasn't happening either, as Conor had withdrawn. The UFC desperately needed a major name to save the event, and they turned to Brock Lesnar. But here's where it gets shady. The UFC allowed Brock to bypass the mandatory 6-month USADA testing window, a rule typically required for any fighter returning to competition. Brock showed up, fought Mark Hunt, won the fight, and then the other shoe dropped. He failed his post-fight drug test. Lesnar tested positive for estrogen blockers, substances commonly used after a steroid cycle to help the body return a hormonal balance. In other words, taking estrogen blockers often means you've been using steroids and are now trying to mask the aftermath. Steroids offer a massive competitive edge, enhanced strength, quicker recovery, and increased pain tolerance that allows fighters to hit harder, endure more damage, and recover faster, creating a dangerous, uneven playing field. For the clean fighter, stepping into the cage against someone using PEDs can be life-threatening. Many in the MMA world believe Brock was clearly on something, but the UFC looked the other way, chasing a short-term payday over long-term safety. Mark Hunt was livid. He filed a lawsuit against not only Brock Lesnar, but also the UFC and Dana White, accusing them of knowingly allowing a doped-up opponent to fight. In the end, the case was dismissed, and to make matters worse, Hunt was ordered to pay a portion of the UFC's legal fees. And just when it seemed like only the UFC was playing dirty, one of the sport's most respected fighters pulled off a sneaky trick of his own. Daniel Cormier DC is one of the most respected figures in MMA, an Olympic wrestler, a double champ, and an all-around stand-up guy. But at UFC 210, he found himself at the center of a little controversy. It all went down the day before his title fight against Anthony "Rumble" Johnson. DC stepped onto the scale and weighed in at 206 pounds, 1 pound over the light heavyweight limit. He stepped off, looking flustered, and everyone was wondering if he would need to shed more weight or forfeit the title. But then, just 2 minutes later, DC returned to the scale, to everyone's surprise, weighed in at exactly 205 pounds. In a span of 120 seconds, he magically dropped over a pound, and did so without breaking a sweat, running, or cutting any weight. Fans and media were left confused, but soon, sharp-eyed viewers noticed something strange. DC appeared to be leaning on the towel. It became clear that Cormier's hands were gently pressing down on the towel his team was holding up to cover him. If you watch the footage closely, you can see him glancing down, subtly adjusting his hands, and making sure the towel was positioned just right. The internet went wild, and Towelgate was born. To his credit, DC eventually came clean years later, admitting, "I may have grabbed the towel in Buffalo." These aren't just stories, they're cracks in the cage. The deeper you look into the UFC, the messier it gets. So if you want more raw, unfiltered truth, subscribe now, because we're just getting started. Let's go back to IFC Battleground 2, year 2000. Not a UFC event, but still incredibly influential. Gon McGee, a literal skyscraper of a man, was facing Brad Gabriel, who was definitely not skyscraper-sized. McGee got on top and started raining down straight vertical elbow drops, one after another, targeting Gabriel's head and neck. Total mismatch. Brutal finish. Watching cage side was Dr. Dom Kleda, one of the ringside physicians for the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board, the same people helping draft the unified rules of MMA later that year. And after watching McGee basically reenact a Mortal Kombat fatality, Kleda's immediate reaction was, ban that. Initially, he wanted to ban elbows altogether, but Big John McCarthy, who was also helping draft the rules, pushed back. Elbows are essential to the sport. You can't just erase them. So they landed on a compromise. Ban only the straight down vertical elbow, the 12-6 motion. Everything else, diagonal, spinning from the side, totally fine. Why that specific angle? According to Big John on Joe Rogan's podcast, it's because state officials had seen karate demos where guys broke blocks of ice with vertical elbows. No, seriously, ice breaking. That was the logic. And to this day, 12-6 elbows are still illegal. Even though pretty much everyone agrees, it makes no sense. You can slam someone's skull with a spinning elbow from standing, but God forbid you drop one straight down from mount. And yes, Jon Jones's only career loss? It came from this exact rule. No more Speedos, the outfit that changed UFC dress code. Alright, let's talk about the time a grown man wore a tiny blue Speedo in front of a global audience and got banned for it. It's UFC 133, 2011. We've got veteran fighter Dennis Hallman squaring off against Brian Ebersol, and Hallman decides this is the perfect moment to settle a bet he made with his teammates by walking out in the tiniest pair of blue briefs ever seen in a sanctioned MMA fight. And we're not talking about compression shorts. We're talking straight up banana hammock, somewhere between a swimsuit and a cry for help. The fight starts, and Ebersol is clearly distracted. Hallman's junk is everywhere. There's a full-blown wardrobe crisis happening in the octagon. Commentators are cracking jokes. The crowd is laughing, and Dana White is furious. He reportedly said it was, quote, disgusting, and that no one would ever fight in the UFC again looking like that. To make things worse, Hallman loses the fight by TKO. And while Dana claimed his release wasn't related to the outfit, let's just say fighters usually don't get cut after one loss if they're veterans with name value. From that day forward, the UFC updated its dress code. Fighters were banned from wearing Speedo-style trunks or anything that might accidentally flash the audience. Fight kits became more standardized, first through sponsors, and later through the Reebok and Venom deals. And now, if you type Dennis Hallman into Google, the top auto suggestions are still Speedo and shorts. So yeah, the legend lives on, just not in the cage. Next up, Keith Hackney walked into the octagon at UFC 3 as a middleweight fighter, standing across from Emmanuel Yarbrough, a super heavyweight sumo wrestler towering at over 600 pounds. It was the type of matchup that defined the chaos of early MMA. No weight classes, bare-knuckle strikes, and rules that encourage creativity, sometimes at the cost of sportsmanship. What followed would become one of the most controversial moments in UFC history, one that prompted the organization to start redefining its boundaries. Hackney, dwarfed by Yarbrough in both size and weight, faced an uphill battle from the first bell. This was no ordinary fight, and Hackney's approach reflected that. Aware of the overwhelming physical advantages his opponent brought to the cage, Hackney targeted the area of least resistance, Yarbrough's groin. Repeatedly, Hackney drove strikes into his much larger opponent's most vulnerable spot, forcing Yarbrough to crumble under the pain. Hackney's unconventional tactics forced the UFC to confront the balance between raw entertainment and professionalism. Exploiting vulnerabilities was one way to win. But what happens when skill rewrites the rulebook instead? BJ Penn didn't just compete in mixed martial arts. He broke the boundaries that defined it. Known as the Prodigy, Penn was one of the rare fighters who seemed unconstrained by the weight divisions meant to keep competition fair. In an era when fighters typically stayed within a single weight class, Penn's willingness to climb the scale and challenge larger opponents revealed a critical flaw in the UFC's framework. Weight classes were too broad and, in some cases, poorly regulated. Penn built his reputation in the lightweight division, where his technical skill and adaptability put him leagues above most of his peers. However, what truly set him apart was his ambition to step outside of his natural weight class and face physically larger and stronger opponents. This ambition was on full display at UFC 46, when he moved up to welterweight to face then champion Matt Hughes. Hughes, a dominant wrestler and the defending title holder, was expected to overpower Penn with his size and strength advantage. Instead, it was Penn who dominated the fight, submitting Hughes in the first round with a rear naked choke. The victory not only secured Penn's status as one of the most versatile fighters of his era, but also forced the UFC to reckon with how it structured its divisions. Penn's dominance forced fairness into the equation. But when it came to cage tactics, another fighter challenged an altogether different kind of rule. Tank Abbott, throwing fighters out. Back in the Wild West days of the UFC, Tank Abbott was known for being an absolute savage. At UFC 11, he fought Cal Worsham, and things got out of control real fast. Tank dropped Worsham with some heavy punches, and then, in true Tank fashion, he just lost it. He straight up tried to throw Worsham out of the octagon. He picked him up and flung him toward the fence like he was tossing out the trash. And here's the craziest part. He almost flew completely out. His body was halfway over the top, and the only thing that stopped him was the cage padding he managed to grab onto. At the time, the UFC didn't have specific rules about that kind of stuff, because no one thought a fighter would literally try to eject someone mid-fight. But after that, the UFC added clear rules banning the act of throwing or pushing fighters out of the cage. It was dangerous, obviously, and it was a bad look for the sport. Tank Abbott already had a reputation for being unpredictable and violent, but this incident pushed the UFC to tighten things up. No more WWE-style body launches. These aren't just weird moments, they shaped the UFC into what it is today. So if you love the raw, untold side of MMA, hit subscribe and join the fight for the full story. Nick Diaz was about to lose 5 years of his career over weed. Nick Diaz never followed the rules, and in 2015, that nearly ended his career. At UFC 183, Diaz made his long-awaited return, facing Anderson Silva in a high-profile showdown. He lost by decision. But weeks later, no one was talking about the fight. The headlines were all about a drug test. Diaz had tested positive for marijuana metabolites. It was his third offense for cannabis use in Nevada. And this time, the Nevada State Athletic Commission dropped the hammer. Hard. They handed Diaz a 5-year suspension and fined him $165,000, a punishment harsher than what most fighters got for using actual performance-enhancing drugs. The room gasped. Reporters were stunned. Meanwhile, Anderson Silva, who tested positive the same night for multiple anabolic steroids, only received a 1-year suspension. The backlash was immediate. Fans, fighters, and media figures across the MMA world called it what it clearly was: unfair, personal, vindictive. A hit job, a Change.org petition demanding the punishment be overturned quickly gained over 100,000 signatures. UFC stars like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor spoke out in Diaz's defense. Even Dana White, never exactly close with Nick, admitted the suspension was ridiculous. At the hearing, one commissioner told Diaz, "Your lawyers were very persuasive, but you don't respect us. This wasn't about weed. It was about power, and Nick had spent years defying theirs." Eventually, public pressure forced their hand. The suspension was reduced to 18 months, and the fine cut to $100,000. But the damage was already done. Nick Diaz had lost another prime year and wouldn't fight again for 6. But sometimes, even when you leave everything in the cage, the recognition doesn't come. At UFC 318, New Orleans, the main event, Max Holloway versus Dustin Poirier, a 5-round war between two legends and the final chapter of Poirier's storied career. From the opening bell, it was electric. Holloway stunned Poirier early. Later, Poirier nearly sealed the deal with a deep choke. By round 5, they were standing toe-to-toe, bleeding, battered, and fueled by pure heart. When the decision came down, Holloway retained his BMF title by unanimous call. 49-47, 49-47, 48-47. But backstage in the press room, the real shock came from what didn't happen. When the post-fight bonuses were announced, Fight of the Night, the coveted $50,000 award, didn't go to Holloway or Poirier. Instead, it was given to a preliminary bout, Brendan Allen versus Marvin Vettori. Holloway's reaction captured what everyone was thinking. How the hell did we not get Fight of the Night? That's __. Let's go tell Dana. Poirier, visibly stunned, echoed the disbelief. We didn't get it? No, it's some bullshit. The MMA world erupted online. Fans, fighters, and media alike called it a robbery. The main event wasn't just the fight of the night, it was the emotional and physical peak of the entire card. Had Poirier received the bonus, he would have broken a record for most fight of the night honors in UFC history. 11 in total, surpassing all others. Now he remains tied. Frustration swept through the community. Holloway confronted reporters live, calm but clearly disappointed, demanding answers, asking the question everyone was thinking. What else did we need to do? Now let's talk about Jon Jones' controversial comeback. After a 15-month suspension for a failed drug test, he was set to return against Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232, a long-awaited rematch scheduled for Las Vegas. Fight week arrived. The posters were up. Fans had already landed in Nevada. Then everything collapsed. Just 6 days before the event, the Nevada State Athletic Commission refused to license Jones. Not because he failed a new drug test, but because he still had trace amounts of turinabol, the same banned substance he tested positive for in 2017, lingering in his system. USADA said it wasn't a new ingestion. They called it a pulsing effect. Scientists backed the idea. Nevada wasn't convinced. With the holidays approaching, they said they needed more time to evaluate. They wouldn't clear Jones to fight, so Dana White made a move no one saw coming. He relocated the entire event. UFC 232 was moved from Las Vegas to Los Angeles on less than a week's notice. California had previously licensed Jones. They reviewed the same data and approved him almost immediately. The card stayed intact. The venue changed. Overnight, fighters, teams, and fans were told to rebook flights, switch hotels, and move training camps across state lines. It was chaos. Fighters on the card lost money. Some couldn't bring full corners. Others had family locked out by the sudden travel shift. One fighter, Megan Anderson, called it disrespectful. Another said, "It'll cost us." It won't cost Jon. It didn't. Jones fought Gustafsson at the Forum in Englewood and dominated. TKO in round 3. He reclaimed the light heavyweight belt and walked away clean. But the message was clear. When a star is big enough, the rules bend. But UFC 232 wasn't the first time Jon Jones disrupted an entire event. Years earlier, his decision led to something even more dramatic. The first canceled in UFC history. It was set to be Jon Jones versus Dan Henderson. UFC 151, Las Vegas. Light heavyweight title on the line. But just 10 days out, disaster struck. Henderson tore his MCL. The fight was off. The UFC scrambled. In desperation, they turned to Chael Sonnen, offering him the fight on short notice. Sonnen said yes immediately. No training camp, no hesitation, just a shot of gold. But Jon Jones said no. Without a main event, Dana White pulled the plug. UFC 151 was canceled. The first pay-per-view in UFC history to be completely scrapped. The fallout was swift and brutal. Fighters on the undercard who had trained for months lost their paychecks. Sponsors pulled out. Fans lost money on flights, hotels, and non-refundable bookings. Dana White didn't hold back. He pointed the finger at Greg Jackson, Jones' coach, calling him a sport killer. He slammed Jones for being selfish, accusing him of costing dozens of fighters their livelihoods. Jon Jones defended his choice. He argued that accepting a new opponent on 10 days' notice, without a full camp, was reckless and unfair. He made a calculated decision, not an emotional one, but the damage was already done. The UFC later rebooked the fight with Sonnen at UFC 159 the following year. Jones won by TKO, but the backlash from UFC 151 never fully disappeared. For many, it was the moment Jon Jones stopped being just a champion and started becoming a controversial figure. Now, let's talk about the scorecards controversy. The octagon has seen knockouts, submissions, and upsets, but nothing causes more chaos than the judges' scorecards. Some decisions don't just confuse fans, they break trust. Take UFC 104. Lyoto Machida versus Mauricio Shogun, 5 hard rounds. Rua chopped at Machida's legs, landed body kicks, and pushed the pace. Almost every media outlet scored it for Rua, but the judges gave it to Machida, unanimous. The crowd booed. Even Dana White later said, "I had it 4-1 Shogun." A rematch was booked. Rua ended it in 1 knockout. Then there's Leonard Garcia versus Nam Fan at the TUF 12 finale. Fan clearly outstruck Garcia all 3 rounds. Worked the body, stayed composed, commentators were already congratulating him mid-fight. The decision, Garcia by split. The reaction, stunned silence, then outrage. Bisping versus Hamill. Sanchez versus Campman. Henderson versus Edgar II. GSP versus Hendricks. Each added to the pile. Inconsistent scoring. Regional bias. Outdated boxing standards. Fighters were left wondering, what matters more? Damage, volume, or control? The UFC revised its criteria in 2017, giving more weight to effective striking and impact. But change has been slow. Commissions still vary. Judging stays subjective. Fighters aim for knockouts. Fans pray for clarity. And every time a close fight goes the wrong way, old ghosts come back to life. Now let's talk about the night. Even GSP's image got a little greasy. GSP always been seen as one of the cleanest guys in the UFC. No failed drug tests, no scandals, just straight up discipline and respect. That reputation stayed solid until his rematch with BJ Penn at UFC 94. That's when things got a little greasy. BJ's team claimed GSP had Vaseline rubbed on his chest and shoulders between rounds to make him harder to grapple. They said it was a sneaky move to shut down BJ's jiu-jitsu from the bottom. And if you watch the footage, they kind of had a point. You can clearly see GSP's cornerman putting Vaseline on his face, which is normal for cuts. But then he rubs it on his shoulders and back too, which is illegal. But the fight went on. GSP looked sharp and dominant, and he ended up finishing BJ in round 4. The commission reviewed everything afterward, but didn't overturn the result. GSP said it was just a breathing technique his team always used. Nothing shady. Still, BJ never let it go. To this day, he insists that the fight wasn't fair, and that he got cheated out of a real chance. I'm totally with BJ on this one. Look, every weekend, it's kind of a tradition now. Me and the boys, we lather up in Vaseline, switch off the lights, and wrestle like it's the finals of some underground championship. And let me tell you, it's no joke. The struggle, the strategy, the sweat, it's real. And before you even say it, no, I'm not talking about anything else being hard. I'm talking about the wrestling, all right? It's brutal out there in the dark. Some fights end with knockouts, but these moments ended with confusion, silence, and controversy. They didn't just shake careers, they exposed the cracks in the sport itself. And while the cameras moved on, these stories still echo. If this is the side of MMA they don't want you to see, then hit subscribe, because this is just the beginning. There's trash talk, and then there's dragging someone's family into it. Cross that line, and it's not just business anymore. It's war. So don't get family involved. You can say your opponent is overrated, has no cardio, or whatever else you want. But the moment you bring up their wife, kids, parents, or anything personal, you have crossed the line. Even though there are no official rules about trash talk, most fighters and fans agree that going after someone's family is cheap and disrespectful. Some fighters have ignored this rule completely. Conor McGregor, Colby Covington, and Chael Sonnen are known for saying wild things. Conor talked about Khabib's wife, his religion, and even his father. Colby took shots at Jorge Masvidal's kids and family. When this kind of stuff happens, fans get upset, fighters get furious, and it just makes everything uncomfortable. Fighters take it seriously because their families are not part of the fight. They did not sign up to be targets, and they're not the ones stepping into the cage. So when you bring them into it, it feels like you're going for the lowest blow possible. It's not about selling the fight anymore. It becomes personal, and once it gets that personal, things can explode quickly. Post-fight brawls, backstage scraps, even press conference meltdowns. A lot of that starts when someone crosses this line. If you do break this rule, just know that the fight might not be the end of it. You might win the match, but you'll be seen as the loser in everyone's eyes. The fake shiny belt. When a fighter wins an interim title, the whole point is that they're the temporary champion until the real champ is ready to defend. The idea is simple. The interim belt holder should be next in line. They should automatically fight the actual champion to decide who the real champ is. That is the entire reason interim belts exist. But here's the problem. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes the UFC gives the title shot to someone else, skips the interim champ, or just leaves them waiting for months. So even though they have a belt around their waist, it ends up feeling kind of meaningless if they are not guaranteed that title fight. Fighters really hate this because winning an interim title is not easy. It's not just handed out. They go through a tough training camp, beat another top contender, and rightfully expect their shot at the undisputed belt. But if the UFC thinks someone else will sell more pay-per-views, the interim champ might get pushed aside. That's why a lot of fans feel like the interim title is fake. It's just a shiny reward with no power behind it. Now the final unwritten rule. In the UFC, there's an unwritten rule fans always talk about. If you want to take the belt, you have to really beat the champ. Either knock him out or dominate every round. Just winning a close decision isn't enough for some fans, or even some judges. And if you think about it, it doesn't really make much sense. Fights are judged round by round, and whoever wins more rounds is supposed to win the fight. But since the champ holds the title, people act like you have to do something crazy to take it from him. So even if the challenger barely edges it out, people still say he didn't really beat the champ. It's like the champion gets bonus points just for being the champion. That's why in super close fights, the champ often keeps the belt, even if a bunch of fans think the other guy should have one. It's not fair, but it happens all the time, and fighters know this. If you're fighting for the belt, you know a close one might not get you the gold. That's why challengers try to either finish the fight or make it super clear they dominated, so there's no doubt in anyone's mind. At the end of the day, this rule isn't official. It's just something people believe, but it still ends up affecting how judges score fights and how fans react. So even if you technically outscore the champ, if it's not clear enough, people might still say you didn't really earn it. In the UFC, you don't just fight the opponent, you fight the system. If you want more deep dives into the fight game's secrets, hit that subscribe button and I'll see you in the next round. Matt Riddle. This lesson seems to be a hard one for fighters to realize. Once a rising force in the UFC's welterweight division, Riddle had all the tools to go far in the championship. Explosive energy, elite takedown defense, and a relentless pace that kept opponents guessing. But it wasn't any physical altercation that ended his UFC career. Instead, it was what showed up on a drug test. On February 26, 2013, Riddle revealed he had failed another test for marijuana, and that was his second violation in less than a year, becoming the obvious breaking point. The UFC released Riddle from the promotion. And here's the twist. Performance-wise, Riddle was thriving. He walked away ranked third in UFC history for takedown defense, an insane 89.3%. He was also 8th all-time in total strikes landed, with a whopping 1,350 shots connected. And without the marijuana-related no contests, his official UFC record would have stood at 10-3, riding a 5-fight win streak. He was on his way to climbing the UFC ranks. But 2 failed drug tests cut that momentum short. Instead of chasing title contention, Riddle was shown the door. Since then, he made a successful jump to professional wrestling. But fans can't help but wonder, what would his UFC career be like if the organization had more lenient laws around marijuana? As a response to this ordeal, White was adamant he'd never grace the octagon again, saying, "Everybody's going to have an excuse for why they were cut." Matt Riddle did an interview before that fight, where he said, "I smoke weed so that I don't beat my children." Then he tests positive for it. He's a fucking moron. That's why he's not here. He's cut because he's a moron. I'll make it real easy for him. We just won't ask him to come back. Thiago Silva. Some might say drugs are a fighter's biggest weakness. And Thiago Silva sure places some merit to those accusations. Silva's story was once all about potential. By 2009, he was a legitimate threat in the UFC's stacked light heavyweight division, and people were already whispering his name in title contention talks. But his rise inside the cage was slowly overshadowed by chaos outside of it. And by the end, Thiago Silva's UFC career had completely imploded. Let's start with the first major red flag. UFC 125, January 1st, 2011. Silva stepped in against Brandon Vera and delivered a dominant performance. It looked like a bounce-back moment, something to put his name back into the mix at 205. But the win didn't last long. Soon after the fight, the Nevada State Athletic Commission announced that Silva's urine sample raised serious concerns. In fact, after testing it in 2 separate labs, they confirmed it was inconsistent with human urine, suggesting Silva had either altered or outright substituted his sample to cheat the drug test. The community erupted and news spread like wildfire. One day later, Silva confessed in a public statement. He admitted to using a urine adulterant in an attempt to alter the results of the drug test, fully acknowledging he had broken the rules. He said, "This was a terrible decision on my part. I am prepared to accept this punishment, learn from it, and move on." And it's safe to say that the punishment was harsh. The win over Vera was overturned to a no contest. He was suspended for 1 full year and fined a whopping $20,000 out of his $55,000 win bonus. All of this, and the added cloud of cheating, followed him from that point forward. However, he got some grace and returned to the octagon in 2012 and picked up a win over Stanislav Nedkov, but never fully regained momentum. Then, 2014 happened. On February 6th, 2014, Silva was arrested in Oakland Park, Florida, in what would become the most damaging incident of his career. Police reports said Silva had entered the Popovich Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Center armed and aggressive. The targets were Pablo Popovich, a respected BJJ coach, and Silva's estranged wife, Thesa Kamiji, who was allegedly in a relationship with Popovich at the time. It was a deeply personal conflict that escalated into a legal disaster. The day before, Kamiji had already filed a report claiming Silva violated a restraining order. Then came the confrontation at the gym, and Silva was arrested and charged with aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, aggravated assault, and resisting arrest without violence. The UFC acted immediately. Dana White didn't hold back. In an interview that same day, he stated, "He will never fight in the UFC again." Minner and Molina. These two fighters are not like the others on this list. This wasn't a knockout, wasn't a submission, but it might as well go down as one of the most damaging L's we've seen in UFC history. And it didn't even happen inside the cage. Two former UFC fighters, Jeff Molina and Derek Minner, were officially suspended by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. But unlike past fighters, it was because of something that cuts deeper in the world of professional sports: gambling. Derek Minner, 34 years old, walked into his UFC bout on November 5th, 2022 with a serious knee injury. He didn't tell the commission. He didn't tell the medical staff. He stepped into the octagon compromised, and within the first round, he was finished by Shaylon Nurdambik. The way it unfolded wasn't just a routine TKO. It immediately raised suspicions. The fight ended in just over a minute, and it looked like Minner didn't belong there at all. But what really triggered the alarm bells was the betting activity before the fight. Unusual wagers came flooding in, all on Nurdambik to win early. That kind of action doesn't happen by accident, and it usually never goes unnoticed. U.S. Integrity, the organization that monitors sports betting irregularities, flagged it immediately. The fight became the focal point of an investigation that would reveal something much bigger than a single injured fighter trying to push through a bad night. Minner was eventually hit with a 29-month suspension for failing to disclose his injury. He's not eligible to return until March 26, 2025. But then the focus shifted to another name, Jeff Molina. At just 27 years old, Molina was considered one of the UFC's brightest flyweight prospects. Fast, sharp, and promising. But behind the scenes, he wasn't just watching that Minner fight, he was betting on it. And worse, he had core inside information. The allegations were that he knew Minner was hurt, and that's why he placed a substantial bet on that specific fight without disclosing anything to the commission. According to reports, Molina admitted to the violation. The result? A full 3-year suspension from sport. He won't be eligible to return until November 2025. But what ties these two fighters together, beyond the bad decisions, is one man, James Krauss. A former UFC fighter turned coach, Krauss was known for his technical mind and analytical approach to fighting. But he was also vocal about betting on MMA. In fact, Krauss had previously said publicly that he made more money from betting than coaching. That raised eyebrows, and now he's right in the middle of a wide-reaching investigation into an alleged illegal gambling operation. Both Molina and Minner trained under Krauss. And after the scandal erupted, the UFC moved fast. Fighters were immediately banned from training at Krauss's gym. He was barred from cornering fighters. His license was suspended. The message from the UFC was clear. Until this is resolved, there's no room for Krauss anywhere near the organization. As of now, Krauss hasn't said a word publicly, and the investigation still continues in court. Minner's punishment ends in early 2025, and Molina's follows later that year. But the stain on their reputations and the broader consequences of this scandal may last much longer. The UFC, like all major sports organizations, is walking a fine line between embracing the world of legalized betting and protecting the integrity of the sport. In the UFC, the cage can make you a legend, or end everything you've worked for in a single second. If this story shocked you, there's a lot more coming. So hit that subscribe button and don't miss what's next.